or to get visas or whatnot, a whole lot of efforts. And okay, well, I think it's about time to begin. I would like to welcome everyone to the seminar of the Center for Institutional Studies, and we're very pleased to have as our speaker tonight Tuomas Pekkarinen. Tuomas is from VATT Institute for Economic Research. VATT is a high caliber economic think tank in Finland. Its mission is to advise policymakers with evidence-based economic research. Tuomas also has affiliations with Aalto University Business School. And I just reminded the colleagues that we had a speaker from that school this April, Christina Huttunen, and they appear to be spouses. So we're very pleased now to have the husband as our speaker. Tuomas's PhD is from European University Institute in Florence, and his master's is from the University of Helsinki. Tuomas's fields are labor, education, and health, and he published extensively in high-ranked journals in these subject areas. Tonight, Tuomas speaks on the making of social democracy, the economic and electoral consequence of Norway's 1936 folk school reform. Tuomas.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about this paper at your seminar. A pity that I cannot come to Moscow, but nevertheless happy for this opportunity. So this is joint work with Daron Acemoglu from MIT, Kjell Salvanes from NHH in Bergen, Norway, and my longtime colleague Matti Sarvemäki, who's now at Aalto Business School. The goal of this paper is to study the political origins of the Nordic welfare states, and especially to try to understand the reasons for the dominance of the social democrats in these countries since the 1930s. And what we try to do here is to study the role of specific policies that these parties implemented in winning over new voters that then enabled them to carry out a quite radical program of reforms over decades. And we're going to focus here on a very specific policy, the effects of which we claim to be able to identify, which is the 1936 school reform that the first social democratic government in Norway implemented after gaining power in 1935. All right, so so I think it's fair to say that there's increasing interest in this Nordic welfare state model, probably linked to increasing rates of inequality in many industrialized countries, and irrespective of one's political views, this model of the Nordic welfare states that has, to an extent, been able to combine high levels of equality and high levels of economic growth has attracted a lot of interest. And these reforms, this model really is a result of policies that were mostly implemented by social democratic governments. So these political parties have profoundly shaped these countries since the 1930s. So this model, is a mix of different policies. Typically, it's a combination of some type of Keynesian stabilization policies, regulation of labor markets, not really by legislation, but by strong social partners and collective bargaining, high level of fiscal redistribution through taxes and social transfers, and fully publicly provided education, social insurance, and health services. And it's important to understand that this model is a radical break from what prevailed in these countries early. So prior to 1930s, it's fair to say that countries like Sweden, Denmark, even to a higher extent Finland, were highly unequal economies with high levels of industrial conflict and very low levels of intergenerational mobility. So this Nordic welfare state model is not a reflection of some underlying long-term structural equality that would have prevailed in these countries for centuries. These policies really represented a break from what had taken place there earlier. And it's also an example of a radical change that is implemented through democratic means. So one could call this kind of quote unquote patient revolution, where a full, important social change is achieved through gradual reforms that are implemented through democratic means. And that, of course, reflects the internal debate within the labor movement in the beginning of the 20th century, where you had this split between the revolutionary fraction, the communists and the Bolsheviks, and then the reformist social democrats fraction. And at the hindsight, one can say that the Nordic welfare model is an example of a state model, is an example of labor movement achieving many of its goals, not all, of course, but many of its goals through the democratic process. So that's why the legacy of this reform is now, it attracts a lot of interest, and I think it's fair to say that in the Nordic countries, it is widely supported. So if you look at the programs of most major parties in the Nordic countries, there's a wide consensus that this is a model that should continue. So the questions that arise are what were the origins of this model? So first of all, what were the impacts of these reforms that the social democratic governments implemented? So that's the first question we want to address here in this paper by studying the effect of this particular policy that we focus on. And then, how did those policies enable the social democrats to carry them out? So in particular, how were they successful in attracting new voters that then turn to support the social democrats, and then basically make this political dominance of these parties possible? But those are the questions that we try to answer in this paper. And the particular policy that we focus on here is the 1936 Norwegian law on rural primary schools. And we focus on this policy because this was one of the first reforms that the social democratic government in Norway implemented. And the way that it was implemented enables us to identify the effect of this policy on the primary outcomes that should be affected by this policy, which are the human capital outcomes. And then also we can look at the effect of this reform on the electoral outcomes. So basically on the political support for the Labour Party. So this reform was the first reform that this government implemented after coming to power. And the goal was to harmonize the quality of primary schooling across different regions in the Norway in a way that I will explain later on. And one can see this reform as the beginning of a series of reforms that the party then implemented during its time in power that then led to a current system of schooling in Norway, which is a comprehensive school system. So the main results, to summarize the main results of this paper, the effect of this reform was to increase long-term income and post-mandatory education in the affected groups. And we also have some evidence that these effects spilled over to the next generation. So you can also see effects on the children of the affected, the parents from this reform. And importantly, this reform also increased the social democratic vote shares in the next elections. So, and the way we interpret this result is that it does not reflect the simple, human capital channel, that basically the increased education as a result of reform would have made voters more likely to vote for social democrats, since still at this time, more educated voters were more likely to vote for the conservative parties. And it is neither the channel of increased political participation seems to explain these results. So the mechanism that we propose is that the reform, as it was successful, it changed the perceptions of the voters and basically showed that this party and this government is a capable government and can enact reforms of this kind, and this led to an increased support towards this party. So I think the contribution of this paper is that we contribute to this already quite vast literature on the origins of social democracy in Europe, which is mostly literature in political sciences and history. But that work has typically emphasized the role of labor unions and the coalition with the agrarian interests that these parties made. What we want to highlight in this paper is the role of education reforms in the building of the welfare state model. And it's often overlooked, but the education policy actually played a very important role in the party programs of the social democratic parties in Nordic countries in the 1930s. And at least in Norway and Sweden, in both countries, the education reforms of this kind were the first policies that these parties implemented after coming to power in 1935 in Norway and almost at the same time in Sweden. The second literature where we try to contribute is literature on successful political reforms, where there is literature on the successful transitions to democratic regimes that highlights, for example, collective action by excluded groups or the accountability enhancing institutions and the role of fiscal policies. There's also theoretical work on what kind of institutional reforms work within democratic political systems. But we claim that there's no earlier work examining the impact of schooling reforms on institutions. And that's where we think we can contribute. And finally, we also contribute to the literature on the relationship between education and democratic institutions. So there's a large literature on whether increased levels of human capital lead to increased support for democratic institutions. There's also literature on the ideological differences in education policies between different political groups. But our argument here is that fulfilling this electoral promise of education reform led to an increased support of these particular political groups that were responsible for this welfare state model. So just to give you some background on the reform, here is first the time series on the vote shares of Norwegian Social Democrats in parliamentary elections in Norway from the early 20th century until 1981. So you have two time series. Here you have the vote share in parliamentary elections and then the corresponding seat share. And as you can see here, the gray areas here are the times during which the Social Democrats were in power. So as of 1935, the 1935 initiated the long period of social democratic rule that was only interrupted by the Second World War, when Norway was occupied by German forces, and the government that actually implemented the reform that I'm going to talk about went to exile in London, and Norway was then, during that time, led by a government led by Quisling, so basically a puppet government imposed by the Germans. But back after the war, the Social Democrats came back to power and then ruled all the way to the mid-60s, when there was when the rule was interrupted by a conservative government. But then again, from 70s to 80s, there was a period of uninterrupted social democratic rule. So really, the 1930s initiated this long period of social democratic dominance. And this is the same pattern that you observe also in Denmark and Sweden. So the Norwegian Social Democratic Party is in many ways quite a representative when it comes to the Western European socialist parties. So they were all founded in the late 19th century and started to participate in parliamentary elections in the beginning of the 20th century. That's also true in the case of the Norwegian Social Democratic Party. The early periods were characterized by internal conflicts between the different fractions within the party. So there was a revolutionary fraction and a reformist fraction. And the Norwegian Social Democratic Party is different from, for example, the Swedish or the German Social Democratic parties in that this revolutionary fraction was the dominant one until late 1920s, which is reflected in the fact that Norwegian Social Democratic Party, unlike the Swedish and the German ones, were members of the Comintern from 1990 to 1923. So there was a strong revolutionary wing in the party, and it's fair to say that its attitude towards parliamentary democracy was somewhat ambivalent. And you know, the tone of their programs is reflected in this election poster that I show you here from 1930. You know, the style is very traditional for a revolutionary socialist party. But this changed in the early 1930s when this reformist fraction became dominant in the party. But the context for this swing in the approach by the Norwegian Social Democratic Party is that, first of all, there was a very bad election loss in 1930. And you can see in this earlier graph that in 1930, their vote share and also the amount of seats in the parliament declined after a period of increase. But there's also changes in the Norwegian society. If you actually in Western Europe, the Norwegian economy was the slowest growing economy during the 1920s. And then there was an increasing threat of fascism, mostly in continental Europe, but also in the Nordic countries, the fascist parties were on the rise. So as a response to these changes, the Social Democrats decided to change strategy and now try to appeal beyond the core supporters of the industrial working class, so also attract rural voters, and to basically change the strategy to try to implement social change through democratic means in the parliament. And that has been the approach of the party ever since. So here's in 1935, the Social Democrats became the largest party and actually gained enough support to form a minority government with the support of the Agrarian Party. It was a minority government with only Social Democratic ministers, but they made a deal with the Agrarian Party that they would support them in the parliament so that they would be able to enact reforms. So here's a picture of the government. The prime minister was called Nygaardvold. So that was the first Social Democratic Party, the government in Norway, apart from a government in 1920s that ruled for 2 weeks. But this was the first one to rule for an extended period. And the committee work on this school reform that we're going to focus on here started almost immediately after the party came to power. And the law was passed already in June 1936. So the goal in this reform was to harmonize the quality of primary schooling across different regions in Norway. So Norway has a very long history of mandatory education, dates back all the way to 1739. And already in 1889, they established compulsory schooling of 7 years. However, there was separate legislation for rural and urban areas. And the basis for that was that there was more demand for basically child labor in the rural areas in the agriculture and fishing. So the thinking was that the demand for education was lower in the rural areas. And as a result, the regulated minimum number of hours in primary school was different from the rural and urban areas, so that children in the rural areas were required to receive less hours of instruction than in the urban areas. And you can see the differences here. These are now calculated cumulative hours of instruction that a child from rural and urban areas in Norway would receive according to the law during his or her primary education. So as you can see from the graph, in the late 19th century, the children in the urban areas would have received approximately twice the amount of instruction than the children in the rural areas. Now, this was seen as a problem from quite early on. So calls to increase the instruction time in rural areas started already in 1902. And there were many parliamentary committees working on trying to reform this system, but basically nothing of substance was done prior to 1935. So as you can see, although there are minor increases in the regulated hours in the rural areas, the difference with respect to the urban areas remains very large until 1935, when the new government came to power and they implemented this folk school reform on the rural areas, so that the number of minimum hours increased. So the law stipulated that the new minimum weeks in rural areas would be 16 weeks of instruction in the first 3 grades of the primary school and 18 in the last 4 grades of the primary school. So that it would be basically the minimum hours increased by 4 weeks in both the lower classes and the upper classes of the primary school, which corresponds to an increase of 30% in minimum requirements. The law didn't only change that, it also included other components. So for the first time, it stipulated the maximum class size on primary schools in Norway, and nationwide level of minimum teacher salaries, and barred physical punishment in schools, and then gave more central government funding, especially to pay for these minimum levels of teacher salaries. So all these aspects of the reform clearly have this tone of increasing the central government control over the primary schools that prior to this reform were pretty much relied on local standards. So the financing was municipal mostly, and then the standards were really determined locally. So really the goal of this reform was to harmonize the quality so that all the schools would have to apply some national level minimum standards. And the reform was implemented so that it was launched in the July of 1937, with the transition period that would end in the July of 1942. Now, obviously, this implementation period was interrupted by the German occupation between 1940 and 1945. But luckily, we have access to data on the actual weeks of instructions in Norwegian schools by municipalities from the late 1920s all the way to the 1960s. So we can actually observe the hours of instructions in different parts of Norway. And in this graph on the right side of the slide, we've plotted the share of students that receiving hours of instructions that are below this post-reform minimum by different regions in Norway. And this graph tells us that, first of all, there was a lot of variation in the share of students that were receiving less hours than the new law stipulated before the reform. But actually, the implementation pretty much followed the plan, despite this German occupation. So it doesn't seem to have affected the implementation a lot. But what you can see in this graph also is that from 1937 to 1943, or 1942 actually, there was a major convergence, so that the share of children receiving less hours than the law stipulated came down a lot in the areas where it was high at the beginning of the period. So to analyze the effects of this reform on, first of all, human capital outcomes, and then on these electoral outcomes, we use data from 3 sources, basically. So to study the effects on human capital and income, we rely on Norwegian register data. So we use 1960 census, which is the earliest census that is available in Norway, and then the population registers that are available from the end of 1960s to today. which give us information on annual income from 1967 to 2010, where we can also observe final educational attainment. Now, I'm not going to talk about the effects on the second generation, so the intergenerational effects of this reform, unless questions arise. But there we are also able to use military test score data on cognitive abilities. But unfortunately, these test scores are not available for the first generation, so the generation that was immediately affected by the reform, since the army at that time didn't yet make conscripts do these tests. So we don't have those data. Then we'll use municipality level electoral outcomes to look at the effects of this reform on the election outcomes. We also use data on candidates by party and municipality in national elections. And then we also use survey data on individual level voting. However, that data are only available from 1957 onwards. And then what makes this study possible is that we also digitalized municipal level school information from 1930 onwards in Norway, so that we have a lot of information on schools in different municipalities in Norway. However, the content varies across years a lot. But the key variable that these data provide us is this distribution of children by weeks of education in different Norwegian municipalities in 1937, which gives us a baseline that basically enables us to identify the effect of the reform, because we are able to see which municipalities already were providing hours of instruction that were in line with the new legislation and which weren't. So to measure the effect of the reform, we basically construct a measure of distance from this post-reform minimum requirements in terms of weeks of instructions by using these data from 1935. So this variable Z now varies between 0 and 1, and it measures the distance by municipality from these new requirements in 1935. So if, for example, the municipality was already giving 16 weeks of instructions for the first 3 grades and 18 weeks of instruction for the last 4 grades, the Z would be equal to 0, because this nominator here would be equal to 0. If, on the other hand, the municipality was only giving the minimum requirements according to the law before the reform, which would correspond to 12 hours in the first 3 grades and 14 hours in the last 4 grades, this measured Z would be equal to 1. And this denominator here, 28, is simply the full implementation of the reform in a municipality that was providing only the minimum requirements before the reform. So basically this variable allows us to classify the rural municipalities according to the distance from the requirements of the reform, and to proxy for how much bite this reform had on each municipality. So you can then look at the variation of this distance from the post-reform requirements, in how that variable varies across different regions in Norway. So in this graph on the left-hand side, you see these pre-distances by municipalities across different areas in Norway. And what you can see here is that, first of all, the urban areas are excluded since they had a separate legislation, so we don't include them in our analysis. But when it comes to rural areas, there's a lot of variation in this distance measure across different regions. And importantly, the areas where the distance was largest, so areas where it is 1 or above 1 even, are not only concentrated in some parts of Norway. So there are areas like that in the extreme north, but also in the central part of the country, and also in the south. And when you then look at what happened to these average weeks of instruction in primary schools in these municipalities, and plot them against this distance measure in 1935, you observe that the reform seems to work in the way that it was intended. So the number of weeks that were provided to the children in primary school increased more in the areas where the distance was largest, and less in the areas that were already close to the post-reform requirements. But importantly, obviously, this distance is not randomly assigned to municipalities. So if you are far away from the post-reform requirements in hours of instructions, the municipality is also more likely to be poorer. So the average income in 1930 was lower in areas that were further away from the post-reform requirements. They were also more agricultural. So the larger share of the labor force was working either in agriculture or fishing. So these differences are important to bear in mind when we look at the results. The way we try to deal with this fact that obviously the distance to the post-reform requirements is not randomly assigned is through basic differences in differences, and also through controlling for linear trends in these observable characteristics of the municipalities, like the average income and the industrial composition of the municipality. So first, let's look at the effects of this reform on human capital and the education outcomes. And that we do this with two specifications. The first one is an event study specification, where we regress the outcome of individual I, so this analysis uses individual level data, born in municipality J in year C, which then corresponds to cohort, and regress that on year of birth fixed effects, municipality of birth fixed effects, and then this variable Z, which is the distance of the municipality of birth from the post-reform requirements, and then we estimate the effect of Z separately for each cohort. So basically, the beta C in this event study tells us the extent to which the outcome Y grows differently between the birth cohort C and the baseline birth cohort, which is the omitted category in this event study, which will be the birth cohort that already had left primary school before the implementation of the reform. So that's the cohort born in 1923 to 1924, as children in Norway start primary school when they are 7. The second, so this the advantage of this event study is obviously that it allows us to first of all detect any pre-trends, if there are any, and also doesn't impose any structure or the functional form on the way these outcome variables Y then evolve after the reform as a function of Z. So basically also allows us to observe whether the changes actually correspond to what we would expect from the effects of the reform. But the cost here is that then we get a lot of parameters. So we get a separate beta coefficient for each cohort. So to have a more parsimonious estimate of the effect of this reform, we also do a traditional differences in differences analysis, where we now only have a single beta coefficient, and we regress Y on the variable Z subindex JC, which is a product of this pi C, which is the share of years that each birth cohort C studied under the new requirements that were implemented in 1938 according to the law. So basically, for the cohort that was the omitted cohort in the event study, the one born in 1924, pi C would be equal to 0. And for the cohort born in 1931, which basically went to school immediately when the reform was implemented, that would be equal to 1. So basically this pi C varies between 0 and 1, where 1 is for the cohort, when it's equal to 1 for the cohorts that went to the primary school only in the post-reform era. So these are the two ways in which we study the effect of this reform. The first, here is a plot of these beta C coefficients from the event study analysis. So what is important to notice here is, first of all, that prior to the cohort born in 1923 to 1924, which is the omitted cohort, which serves as the baseline here, that shouldn't have been affected by the reform. We do not see any diverging trends across as a function of the variable Z. So there's no evidence of pre-trends here. But immediately after these cohorts start to be affected by the reform, we start to see diverging trends, so that the effects, the municipalities that were further away from the pre-reform, the post-reform requirements, experienced higher rates of increase of years of education, which is the outcome variable here. So then the years of education, they start to increase more in the areas that were further away from the post-reform requirements. So that, and also the differences increase as the cohorts are exposed to more years under the post-reform primary school. So the impact is smallest for the cohort that only spent a small fraction of their primary school years in the post-reform era, and large for the ones that spent the full primary school in the post-reform era. The solid line here is what we would see if the reform was implemented fully in 1938. So that basically assumes that Z is equal to 1 if the cohorts was for the cohorts born after 1931. So basically, what this graph tells us, that actually the event study estimates pretty well follow this, what we would have expected for the full implementation of the reform in the case of men. For the case of women, the effects are a bit more mixed and do not fully align with what we would expect with the full implementation. But we do observe positive effects there as well for the cohorts that were fully exposed to the reform. So the differences in difference estimate, if we don't impose any, if we don't introduce any controls for these linear trends, is 0.47 years of education for men, which, if you compare it to the pre-reform baseline, which is 9 years, corresponds to approximately 5% increase in years of education. For women, the estimate is slightly lower, but their baseline is also lower, around 8 years of education, but that would correspond to a 2% increase in years of education. Because then, as we, the reform was not randomly assigned, so it's important to control for underlying trends. We can introduce linear trends by region, by the linear trends in the income level of the municipality, and in the share of workers in agriculture and fishing. We see that it's important to control for region when you look at the effects on men, but after that, the further controls for linear trends do not really affect the results. For women, the effects are not as stable, but still, with full controls for all the trends that we can include, we still get a positive effect, albeit a small one, also for women. And it's important to understand here that this reform didn't impose any increases in the compulsory years of education. So all the positive effects on the years of education that we see here reflects effects on the individuals continuing beyond compulsory school of education. We can also look at the effects of this reform on income, and also there we see positive effects, although these are not as stable with respect to introducing controls for the other trends as the years of education are, which basically probably reflects the fact that there was regional convergence in the income levels that is not related to the reform also across Norway during this period. But still, we see positive effects on men and actually stronger effects on the income for women. So the way to interpret these effects on human capital outcomes is that basically for men, the reform increased years by 0.3 years compared to the baseline of 9 years, and income by 4 log points. And for women, it's 0.1 years from the baseline of 8 years. The income effect is actually larger than for men, so for 7 log points. So these are positive effects. And then we get also positive, but mostly insignificant effects on intergenerational estimates that I will not go into due to the interest of time. It would be tempting to interpret this effect that this is now an intention to treat effect that we estimate as to use this setting as an IV design to estimate the effect of hours instruction. But we have to remember that this reform did not only change the hours of instruction, but it also implemented other changes in schools. So it's unlikely that our data captures all dimensions of the reform. So we are reluctant to estimate anything beyond the intention to treat effects here. So basically, one should only interpret these effects as the effects of this reform as such, not really the particular features of this reform. So then when it comes to effects on electoral outcomes, we are forced to use a slightly different model because we don't have data on how different cohorts voted, because we only have municipal level electoral outcomes from different years. So basically, here we only use variation over time across different municipalities. So it's we can do an event study here as well. We will get different betas for different years as a function of the distance from the post-reform requirements in 1935. And then also a diff-in-diff specification where we now estimate the effect, the beta that is as a function of Z for years after the 1945. So we get only one estimate for beta in the diff-in-diff specification. And we regress now, what the outcome variable now is the vote share of different parties in municipality J in year T. And again, controlling for full set of year effects and the municipality fixed effects. So here are the event study estimates. Now the baseline year is 1933. Again, we do not see any consistent pre-trends here. So although there are differences, they don't have any clear pattern. But in 1945, the vote share of the Labour Party, which is the next election from 1936, because there was the Second World War in between and no elections held, we see that the vote share of the Labour Party, the Social Democratic Party, increased more in the municipalities that were further away from the post-reform requirements in 1935. And this positive effect is robust to introducing controls for different linear trends and seems to be persistent over time as well. So the diff-in-diff estimates of the effect of the reform are all positive and reasonably robust to introducing controls, so that the effect varies really between 0.7 percentage points to 0.3. And we can also obviously run these same regressions for other parties, and these results indicate that the positive effects on the votes for the Labour Party are really coming at the expense of votes for the Liberals and the Conservatives, although these estimates for the Liberals and Conservatives are not quite robust to different controls, and they jump up and down, but they are consistently negative. So that seems to indicate that the Labour Party was successful in attracting voters from these parties. On the back of the envelope calculation, based on these results, basically implies that the Labour Party's rural vote share grew by between 1.4 and 4.6 percentage points faster between 1933 and 1945 due to the reform. So you can compare this to what actually the time series of vote share of the Social Democrats in urban and rural parts of Norway. And interestingly, what you see here is that if you compare the outcomes in 1936 and 1945, basically for the first time in 1945, the vote share in the rural areas was higher than in the urban areas. So it really is consistent with this reform being successful in attracting voters in the rural areas for the Social Democrats. Now, with the time that I have, I'll shortly talk about different mechanisms. So it's unlikely that this effects on the increased support for the Labour Party would be a result of these human capital effects that we showed in the beginning. First of all, the directly affected individuals, so those who really benefited from this school reform, would have been too young to vote in the 1945 elections, where we first see the strongest effects. But also during that time in Norway, there was a still strong negative correlation between level of education and the support for Social Democrats. So Social Democrats was still back then a party of the working classes and voters with quite low levels of education. It's also unlikely that these results reflect increased mobilization in terms of political participation. We see no impact on turnout in elections, which were already at a very high level prior to this reform in Norway. Neither do we see any effect on the number of candidates for the Social Democrats. So that was not affected by this reform, according to our results. Instead, we claim that what is generating these effects are changing perceptions about the Labour Party. So the electoral effects are coming from municipalities that, first of all, had no experience on Labour rule. So here, if you estimate these event studies separately by municipalities who had never had a Social Democratic mayor prior to 1935, and municipalities that have had one, actually you see that the effect is coming almost exclusively from the municipalities that had no experience of Social Democratic rule. So really that would be consistent with these voters in these municipalities changing their perceptions about the level of competence of the Social Democrats in implementing these policies. Also, we can use electoral survey data that unfortunately we only have from 1957, but there we can see, voting by, different individuals. So we can regress vote for the Labour Party on individual level variables. These data do not allow us to identify the effect of the reform in the same way as we did in the diff analysis using the register data, but we can still here observe whether the voters are in rural or urban areas, so low density or high density areas, and whether according to their age they would have been affected by the reform, or whether according to the age of their children would have been affected by the reform. And these survey data regressions show that whereas still in 1957, the unaffected individuals who were unaffected directly by the reform in low density areas were less likely to vote for Social Democrats, or parents whose children wouldn't have been affected were less likely to vote for the Social Democrats. For the affected groups, so the individuals that were young enough to have been affected by the reform directly, or who had children who were young enough to be affected by the reform directly, this difference between the rural and the urban areas basically cancels out, and the vote share of the Social Democrats in these groups increase a lot. So that's consistent with the individuals that were affected by the reform switching to vote for the Social Democrats, which would be consistent with these changing perceptions, interpretations that we have. So to conclude, the transformation of Social Democratic parties from this revolutionary program to a reformist program is a major political development. It actually represents a fracture in the socialist movement in Europe. So then the communists went their own way and the Social Democrats went their own way. And we claim that this paper is the first major reform that the Norwegian Social Democrat launched after gaining power. And it also the case that in Sweden, the school reform was one of the first reforms that they initiated after taking power. And the goal here was to gradually move towards comprehensive school system and start by improving the primary education, the quality of primary education in rural areas, where it was at a lower level than in urban areas. And the takeaway from our analysis is that the reform was effective in increasing the long-term income and post-mandatory education, but it also led to electoral outcomes. So the vote share of the Social Democrats increased. And we suggest that the reason for this is these changes in the perceptions about the competence of the Social Democrats in power. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Tuomas. That was a very interesting insight into the making of the welfare state. We are now opening Q&A. Are there any questions or comments to the paper, please? Any?
So may I start?
Of course, Bernardo, please.
So, well, first, this is more like a clarification question. So, if I understood correctly, the reform is increased the amount of schooling, like the number of weeks. So, at least in theory, it was more about the quantity rather than the quality, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, although there were other aspects of the reform, as I mentioned, it also imposed the minimum class size for the first time, increased teacher salaries, and the amount of central government funding to the municipalities. So there is a qualitative aspect to the reform as well. But of course, we cannot quantify the different aspects of the reform. So what is visible to us in the data are the changes in the hours of instruction. Yes.
Okay, thanks so much.
Sorry, may I follow up, because now I'm coming to the main point. So I'm thinking that well, in Latin America, one important policy discussion point is about inequality. Yeah, some people have tried to push for reforms in education, thinking that this will end up reducing inequality. But I assume that the context is a bit different, because I think now in terms of amount of schooling is not much that you could increase, but there may be some reforms that can increase quality. I don't know if you see any parallels or any if this reform could be somehow extrapolated to 21st century in Latin America, to see some similar, let's say, improvement in Latin American countries that have been kind of stuck as they are in this middle income trap, as it's called.
Yeah, so yeah, I don't know the Latin American context that well. So, but the big difference between the pre-reform and the post-reform systems is that the pre-reform was really the primary schools relied on municipal funding almost exclusively, and the reform made the funding more reliant on central government, and then it has this fiscal federalism aspect to it. Basically, obviously the funding increased more in the areas that didn't have, enough own revenue to fund high quality teaching, so they then received more funding from the central government. So in that respect, so at least in North America, and the United States is famous for it has a impressive public education system, but the funding is local. So obviously then the local capabilities affect the funding situation quite drastically. So here the whole idea of the reform was to harmonize the quality, both in terms of the quantity of instructions within the school year, but also when it comes to these the funding and the requirements on teachers.
Thank you. Maria has a question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I do have probably either a clarification question or comment. The school reform, which affects the number of weeks of schooling in the composition of classes, that's also affect the relationship between parents and children. because they spend more or less time at home. Parents are more or less involved into students' life, which also means that that affects the mechanism of preference transmissions from parents to children. Do you try to account for that somehow?
So the problem we have in the data is that we don't really observe a lot about the parents of these directly affected cohorts. You have to understand that the cohorts are already born in the 1920s and 1930s, so their parents would have been born in the 19th century, and their outcomes we don't observe in the register data, so we cannot do intergenerational analysis on the first directly affected cohort. So you're right that any education reform that basically increases the amount of time the children spend in school, you would expect that would potentially decrease the correlation of children's outcomes from whatever characteristics of the parents that you want to choose. For example, the education level, income level, and so forth. But we're unable to study that because we don't observe the parents of these children. Yeah, I agree. That would be something that you would expect from a reform like this, but we cannot really say anything on that because we cannot do that kind of analysis here.
Okay, just to speculate a little bit on that, or a little bit further, is that in many Nordic countries, as far as I understand, there was a movement in school education toward like project-based learning, which also affects that family, which also has an impact on like involvement of parents in doing project with children, spending more time with them. So it's not just like how many weeks you spend at school, but what is the quality of that time. So if you are assigned some project, you come to your parents, like, I don't know, to make a history of your family or something like that, and you know more about your parents, and you somehow decide whether you want to follow their preferences or to change them. So I do believe that the school reform goes much more beyond those like hours of schooling toward how it works within the families. So I do understand that you don't have data on that, but I believe that the changes is that substantial because the huge change in the reform includes many things like that.
Yeah, and you're right that this reform then implements a new curriculum as well, which we don't observe here. So there was a new study plan for the primary school. It's hard to say how it was implemented. If we would see somehow variation in the implementation of that curriculum, we could study the effects of that. But unfortunately, that is not possible here. But I think I'm right in saying that this was not as radical as many of the core supporters of the Social Democrats would have wanted. So, for example, you look at the Social Democratic Party program, there was the requirement of abolishing teaching of religion in schools. That was not implemented. So basically, the religion was still taught in exactly the same way as it used to be. So the change really here was gradual. When it comes to these new pedagogical innovations, they are more recent innovations, and you're right that that kind of teaching has become more prevalent in the Nordic school systems. I'm not aware of studies on the effects of those reforms, unfortunately. The problem often with curriculum changes is that you would really need to see how it's implemented, and because in the end it's going to be the teacher who chooses what he or she teaches, and we would really need to observe that. So I don't, and you're probably right about the likely effects, but I'm not aware of any work on that, unfortunately.
Thank you. Please, any further questions and comments? Timur, of course. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I have two questions. One is you mentioned in the introduction intergenerational mobility, and but now you say you don't have access to the parents' data for this. Maybe you can assess the intergenerational mobility geographically in regions that were more affected by the reform than not. Is there any evidence of the effect of reform on mobility? or for the cohorts, for the affected cohorts?
Yeah. So we can see. I mean, the income effects already speak to that to an extent. So obviously, as there is positive effect on income, basically that implies that, and the affected municipalities were the poorer ones. So this reform, to a limited extent, contributed to regional convergence in income levels by basically boosting incomes more in the affected areas than in non-affected areas. So in that sense, you would expect, had we been able to observe the income levels of the parents of these children, this would have had a, not probably large, but still a positive effect on intergenerational income mobility. And that's, I've done work on in earlier papers on the Finnish comprehensive school reform that was implemented in the 1970s, and studies the effect of that on the intergenerational income mobility. And there you see effects of that kind. There's similar kind of work from Sweden by Morten Palme and Kostas Megir, and from Norway by Kjell Salvanes and co-authors. So I think the consensus in the literature now is that these kind of what you could call quote unquote progressive education reforms, that the affected groups are likely to be the disadvantaged groups, they do have a positive effect on intergenerational mobility in that respect.
Okay, Timur, anything further?
One additional question about voting data. Probably I missed it during the presentation. Is there evidence that there was a change in geographical, the electoral geography, I mean, after the reform? So you said this was a very first social democratic government, and what were the patterns of voting in the voting for this government in the first place?
Yeah. So what you see overall in the electoral time series is that during this time, the vote share of the Social Democrat increases more in the rural areas than in the urban areas. And actually, whereas it used to be a urban party prior to the mid-1930s, these vote shares, they converge. And what we show in the paper is that within the rural areas, this change is really coming only from these affected municipalities. So we claim that, within the rural areas, this reform was really successful in increasing the vote share of the Social Democrats. And that's a major contributor to this convergence of the vote share by these different geographic areas. So really, yeah, it's basically partly as a result of this reform, the Social Democrats became a nationwide party in a sense that they now had major support both from the rural and the urban voters, whereas previously they had been mostly supported by the industrial workers in the urban areas.
Thank you. Let's see. Any further questions? Any comments? Tuomas, if I may, a couple of questions. First, did you see any micro-macro paradox here? In other words, did you try to measure the contribution of this reform to Norway's economic growth at the macro level?
Well, yeah, so we haven't made those calculations, but it's important to keep in mind that we don't observe any negative effects on the unaffected areas. So in that sense, you would expect the effect on economic growth, at least income per capita, to be positive. Okay. How large it is, I'm reluctant to speculate on because we really haven't made any calculations of that kind. And it's important also that our income effects were not that robust, so there were other trends taking place during the same time. So yeah, I'm hesitant to say how important this was in terms of the macro effects.
Okay, well then, the second question is there any chance to assess the impact of this reform on inequality? And in the case of Norway, as it appears from your paper, there was a major divide between the urban and rural parts of the population, and the reform specifically target the rural population.
Yeah. So,
you observe, if I may, you observed an increase in income, of course, but the
Yes.
question is it possible to see a gap between people being able to achieve top positions in the industry, and because they received better education? Do you see any reduction of the gap?
Yeah, we haven't
between
looked
urban and
at
rural?
the occupational status outcomes or things like that. And also, since we don't do any analysis on the urban areas, it's hard to figure out what would have happened to the overall inequality. But certainly within the rural areas, this would decrease income differences. And they were quite large, especially across municipalities in Norway before the reform. Now, again, I haven't calculated, what was the effect on the income differences, the quantitative effect, but certainly the gap would have decreased as a result of these positive effects on the reform on the affected municipalities. And that's now, I mean, we claim to have a proxy of lifetime earnings for these individuals. So we measure the earnings at a quite late age, which is 1967 when we observed them for the first time. So the oldest ones are already 60, close to 60 years old. But nevertheless, we would claim that you should interpret the income effects that we estimate as the effects on a good proxy for lifetime earnings. So in that sense, yeah, you would expect this to reduce income inequality. How much in total, then you would need to have the rural urban areas in the analysis as well, because we don't know now what happened in those areas.
Well, if I may, my question is not so much about income inequality, which quite obviously was affected in a predictable way, but about what sometimes is called the allocation of talent. There was a paper on the allocation of talent in US economic growth a couple of years ago, which showed that because some barriers to accessing top positions in the economy between racial minorities and gender and whatnot were reduced, there was a big contributor to the US economic growth. And I think it might be interesting to see if you observe any impact of this reform on top talents in the rural areas being able to earn an appropriate payoff to these talents.
That is an interesting suggestion. So especially then in this context, I think the interesting outcome would be to look at the effect of the probability of working in something different than agriculture and fishing. That was the typical. That's a good suggestion. Certainly something to look at. Yeah, we haven't thought about that. That's okay. That's
excellent. Thanks. Okay, well, anything further? If none, then all that remains to be done is to thank Tuomas very much for a very informative and thought-provoking presentation. It's a rare opportunity for us to get some first-hand evidence of how these welfare states were built in the Nordic countries. So thanks very much, Tuomas. And Bernard, can you please announce what's coming up next?
Yes, well, also thank you very much, Tuomas, for your presentation, and good luck with this paper. And well, we have in 2 weeks' time Giuseppe Moccelli from the University of Surrey, and he will be presenting his paper titled "Voting Contagion and the Trade-off Between Public Health and Political Rights: Quasi-Experimental Evidence from the Italian 2020 Polls." So this is in 2 weeks' time, 25th of November, same time, same place. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. Yeah,
so we'll see each other in 2 weeks. Thanks very much and stay safe. Bye-bye.